There's a particular magic in watching tiny crystals gather at the edge of cream, watching something liquid slowly turn solid beneath your fingers. Imagine standing in a desert, the sun bearing down in white heat, and someone hands you something impossible, something cold enough to make you shiver. The sensation alone would have been revolutionary, miraculous even. But more than that, it would have required an entire hidden world of human ingenuity, miles of winter ice carried across oceans, ancient engineering that captured cold from the night sky itself, salt that could make ice colder than ice. For thousands of years, before the first electric hum of a refrigerator, before the first mechanical compressor clicked to life, humans found ways to freeze sweetness under impossible conditions. They built towers that caught wind, dug pits that held winter through summer, and learned that certain combinations, ice and salt, patience and motion, could transform cream into something that dissolved on the tongue like a sweet frozen whisper. How did they do it? The story begins not with ice cream, but with something older and more fundamental, the human desire to preserve winter. In the sun-scorched deserts of ancient Persia, around 400 years before the Common Era, engineers looked at the impossible task before them, keeping ice frozen through months of blistering heat, and decided to build the solution from mud, straw, and mathematics. They called these structures yakhchāls, which translates simply as ice pits, though the name hardly captures their elegance. From a distance, a yakhchāl looked like an enormous beehive made of earth, rising from the desert floor with a dome that could reach 20 meters high. But the real marvel lay beneath the ground, where thick walls of a special mortar, made from sand, clay, egg whites, lime, goat hair, and ash, created underground chambers that could hold thousands of cubic meters of ice. The engineering was breathtaking in its subtlety. During winter nights, water would flow from underground aqueducts called qanats into shallow pools beside the yakhchāl. These pools were shaded from the sun by massive walls built in an east-west orientation, sometimes as tall as 15 meters. In the clear, dry air of the desert, something remarkable happened. The water radiated its heat upward into the night sky. Even when air temperatures hovered above freezing, the surface of the water in these pools would cool enough to form ice. Workers would arrive in the cold hours before dawn to break the ice into slabs and carry them down into the yakhchāl's underground chambers, layer by layer, separated by straw and brushwood to prevent them from freezing together into one unmovable mass. The ice would accumulate through the winter. The dome overhead did more than provide shade. Its shape and construction created a natural circulation of air, with vents at the top and bottom, allowing cool air to flow in while warm air escaped. Some yakhchāls incorporated barred gears, wind towers that captured even the gentlest breeze and channeled it downward into the storage chamber. The walls themselves were marvels of thermal engineering, built from a material called sarouge that could be as thick as 2 meters. The ash acted as insulation, while the other materials created a waterproof, heat-resistant barrier. At the bottom of the structure, drainage holes connected back to the qanat system, allowing melted water to flow away without warming the remaining ice. Every detail served a purpose. Every measurement reflected generations of observation and refinement. By summer, when temperatures in the desert could soar beyond 40 degrees Celsius, the yakhchāl held its treasure of winter ice. The thick walls, the circulating air, the careful layering of straw between the ice blocks, all of it worked together to preserve what should have been impossible. 400-year-old yakhchāl in Maybod was estimated to produce and store 50 cubic meters of ice annually, roughly 3 million ice cubes worth. This ice served many purposes. It preserved food, cooled water for drinking, and provided relief from the oppressive heat. But it also enabled something more delightful, the creation of frozen desserts. The Persians poured fruit syrups over shaved ice to create sharbat, a name that would eventually evolve into sherbet and sorbet in other languages. They mixed the ice with saffron, rosewater, grape juices, and pomegranate, creating refreshments that were both cooling and medicinal, believed to restore balance to the body in extreme heat. Some of these treats moved closer to what we might recognize as ice cream. Around 400 years before the Common Era, a dessert called fallow dare emerged. Thin vermicelli noodles frozen in a semi-solid syrup of rose water and lime juice. The texture was unlike anything else, icy but tender, sweet but tart, with the noodles providing a gentle resistance between the teeth before melting away. The yakhchāl made all of this possible, standing as proof that cold could be captured and held, that winter could be stored for summer, that human ingenuity could overcome what seemed like the fixed laws of nature. As centuries passed, the art of making frozen sweets grew more sophisticated, and the yakhchāl became the foundation for something richer and more complex. Around the time Arab culture spread across Persia in the 7th century, cooks began experimenting with milk and cream in their frozen desserts, moving beyond simple fruit ices into territory that would genuinely deserve the name ice cream. The transformation happened gradually, born from the meeting of Persian ice-making expertise and Arab culinary innovation. Cooks discovered that milk, when frozen with the ice from the yakhchāl, created a smoother, more luxurious texture than fruit syrups alone. But milk presented new challenges. It froze harder than water-based syrups, and the fat separated in unpleasant ways if not handled carefully. Someone, history has not preserved their name, discovered that adding certain ingredients could solve these problems. Salep, a flour ground from the dried tubers of wild orchids, became a key ingredient. When mixed into milk or cream, it created a stretchy, elastic quality that prevented large ice crystals from forming. The frozen dessert became smoother, more resistant to melting, with a texture that was uniquely satisfying. Gathering the orchid tubers was painstaking work, done in the wild mountains where the plants grew, but the result justified the effort. Mastic added another dimension. This was the dried sap of an evergreen shrub, crystalline and aromatic, with a flavor somewhere between pine and cedar. When ground into a fine powder and incorporated into the freezing mixture, it contributed a subtle complexity and helped maintain the dessert's structure. The combination of salep and mastic, along with milk, cream, sugar, and flavorings, created something remarkable: bastani, traditional Persian ice cream. The flavors reflected the bounty and refinement of Persian cuisine. Saffron, those precious red threads harvested from crocus flowers, turned the ice cream a delicate golden color and added an earthy, slightly bitter complexity that balanced the cream's richness. Each thread had to be hand-picked from the flower, and it took dozens of flowers to produce even a small amount of saffron, making it one of the most expensive ingredients in the world. But Persia was the heart of saffron cultivation, and the spice appeared in countless dishes, from rice to stews to sweets. Rosewater brought its own magic, distilled from rose petals gathered in the cool morning hours when their fragrance was most concentrated. The flavor was floral without being overwhelming, a whisper rather than a shout, complementing the saffron rather than competing with it. Pistachios grown in the dry regions of Persia added their distinctive green color and buttery crunch when chopped and folded into the mixture. Sometimes the ice cream contained pieces of frozen clotted cream, thick, rich cream that had been heated slowly until it separated and formed golden clots. When frozen separately and broken into chunks, these pieces created pockets of intense richness throughout the ice cream, little treasures to discover with each spoonful. Making bastani required skill and patience. The mixture had to be prepared carefully. The salep dissolved completely to avoid lumps. The saffron steeped in warm milk to release its color and flavor. Then came the freezing, which happened in metal containers surrounded by ice from the yakhchāl. Workers would scrape the frozen cream from the sides of the container, mixing it back into the liquid center, over and over, until the entire mixture achieved the right consistency. Frozen but still soft enough to serve, smooth but with a distinctive elastic quality from the salep. The result was unlike any other frozen dessert in the world at that time. It was rich but not heavy, sweet but balanced by the complexity of saffron and rose, with a texture that resisted melting even in the heat of a Persian summer. And it all depended on the ice preserved in those remarkable structures rising from the desert floor. The technology and the treats it made possible began to travel. When Arab forces conquered Persia around 650 of the Common Era, they didn't just take territory, they absorbed knowledge, techniques and tastes. The methods for storing ice and making frozen desserts spread across the Middle East, from Baghdad to Damascus to Cairo, adapting to local conditions and preferences but retaining their essential character. In Syria, cooks developed bouza, an ice cream that took the elastic quality of salep even further, creating a dessert that could be stretched and pulled like taffy. Vendors would pound the mixture with enormous wooden mallets, incorporating air and developing the stretchy texture, then serve it in ways that showed off its unique properties. Far to the east, in China, frozen desserts were developing along a different path, but one that would eventually intertwine with the Persian tradition in fascinating ways. But that convergence was still centuries away. waiting for travelers and traders to carry techniques and tastes across the vast distances of the Silk Road. For now, in Persia and the lands touched by Persian influence, the yakhchāls stood as the essential technology, the enabler of cold in hot places, the structure that made ice cream possible when ice cream should have been impossible. While Persian engineers perfected their desert ice houses, halfway across the world a different solution to the same problem was emerging, shaped by a different climate and different resources. In the lands that would become China, as early as 700 years before the Common Era, people discovered that ice could be harvested from frozen rivers and lakes in winter, then stored in underground pits for summer use. The Chinese approach was simpler in some ways than the elaborate yakhchāls of Persia, but no less ingenious. Workers would cut blocks of ice from frozen waterways during the coldest months and transport them to deep pits dug into the earth. The pits were lined with stone or packed earth, and the ice blocks were layered with straw, reeds, and sometimes sawdust for insulation. In northern regions, where winters were harsh and long, enough ice could be stored to last through the hot months. By the Tang dynasty, which flourished from 618 to 97 of the Common Era, ice storage had become sophisticated enough to support a thriving culture of frozen treats. Historical records describe a dessert called souchong, literally crispy mountain, made by combining milk and rice, then freezing the mixture using stored ice. The Emperor Tang of Shang reportedly employed a staff of more than 2,000 people, including 94 dedicated ice workers, whose sole responsibility was managing the imperial ice supply. The method of freezing was direct. Containers of the milk and rice mixture would be placed in larger vessels packed with ice, similar to the pot freezer method that would later appear in Europe. The mixture had to be stirred constantly to prevent it from freezing into a solid, inedible block. This was exhausting work, requiring someone to scrape the frozen mixture from the sides of the container and fold it back into the center, over and over, for what could be hours. What emerged from this labor was different from Persian bastani in flavor and texture, but similar in its essential nature, a frozen dairy dessert that required ice, patience, and considerable human effort. The rice provided a subtle sweetness and helped prevent the mixture from becoming too icy, while the milk created a creamy base. Sometimes fruit was added, or honey for additional sweetness. During the Tang dynasty, wealthy families and the imperial court had regular access to these frozen treats. By the later dynasties, particularly the Ming and Qing periods, ice vendors appeared in cities during summer months, selling shaved ice and frozen desserts to those who could afford them. Illustrations from the Ming dynasty, which lasted from 1368 to 1644, show ice vendors in summer, their precious cargo kept cold in copper containers that provided better insulation than ceramic or wood. The Chinese also discovered something that would prove crucial to ice cream making around the world. Salt could make ice colder. When salt was mixed with ice, the mixture's temperature dropped well below the freezing point of water. This wasn't magic, though it might have seemed like it to early observers. The salt disrupted the ice's crystalline structure, forcing it to absorb heat energy from its surroundings as it melted, which paradoxically made everything colder. Some sources suggest that saltpeter, potassium nitrate, was used even more effectively than common salt for this purpose. Saltpeter could lower the temperature of an ice bath significantly, creating conditions cold enough to freeze cream and milk mixtures quickly. The knowledge of this technique may have traveled along trade routes, or it may have been discovered independently in different places. What matters is that it worked, transforming ice from merely cold to cold enough to freeze other things. These parallel traditions, Persian and Chinese, developed largely independently for centuries, each perfecting its own methods for capturing and using cold. The Persian yakhchāls created ice where ice shouldn't exist, using evaporative cooling and careful engineering. The Chinese harvested natural ice and stored it with equal care, developing their own frozen desserts and understanding the chemistry of salt and ice. But the world was not static, and neither were the people in it. Traders moved along the Silk Road, carrying not just silk and spices but also ideas and techniques. Travelers told stories of the wonders they had seen and tasted. And slowly, gradually, the knowledge of frozen desserts began to spread beyond its places of origin. The Mongol Empire, which at its height in the 13th century stretched from China to the edges of Europe, facilitated this exchange. Mongol rulers and their courts were exposed to both Persian and Chinese culinary traditions. They encountered bastani in their western territories and milk-based frozen desserts in their eastern lands. Some historians believe that this exposure helped spread frozen dessert techniques across a vast geographic area, planting seeds that would eventually bloom into new traditions. By the time Marco Polo, if he indeed made the journeys attributed to him, travelled through Asia in the late 1300s, frozen desserts were established in multiple cultures across the continent. The legend that Marco Polo brought ice cream to Italy from China has been largely debunked by historians. There's no mention of frozen desserts in his writings, and ice cream already existed in various forms in different places by his time. What is true is that knowledge flowed along trade routes carried by merchants and travellers whose names have been lost to history. Techniques cross-pollinated. A Persian merchant visiting China might learn about saltpeter's ice-chilling properties. A Chinese trader in Damascus might taste bastani and wonder about the elastic texture created by salep. These small exchanges, multiplied over centuries and across thousands of miles, gradually spread the technology of making and preserving frozen desserts. But all of these methods, whether Persian or Chinese, European or Arab, shared one fundamental requirement: ice. Without ice, there could be no ice cream. And ice, in most of the world, was seasonal, available only when winter provided it, or when you lived in a place cold enough to produce it year-round. The question that would occupy inventive minds for centuries was how to make ice more available, more reliable, more abundant, how to turn this seasonal luxury into something more dependable. The answer, when it came, would transform not just ice cream but the entire way humans preserved and transported food. The knowledge of frozen desserts reached Europe through multiple pathways carried by travelers, merchants and conquering armies, each leaving traces of technique and taste. By the 16th century, something resembling ice cream had appeared in the courts and kitchens of wealthy Europeans, though the legends about how it arrived are more colourful than accurate. One persistent story claims that Catherine de' Medici brought ice cream to France when she married Henry II of France in 1533, bringing Italian chefs with her who knew the secrets of frozen desserts. It's a romantic tale, and one that the Victorians particularly love to repeat. The truth is more complicated and less dramatic. No Italian chefs accompanied Catherine to France during the Medici period, and frozen desserts already existed in France before she was born. The legend persists because it makes a good story, attributing the spread of a delightful treat to a single dramatic moment rather than the slow, undocumented accumulation of knowledge that actually occurred. Similarly, Marco Polo is often credited with bringing ice cream from China to Italy, introducing sorbet-style desserts after learning of them during his travels. Yet there's no mention of frozen desserts in any of his writings, and historians have found no evidence to support this claim. Some scholars even question whether Marco Polo ever reached China at all. These myths, introduced largely by Victorian writers who loved tales of exotic origins, have obscured the messier, more interesting reality of how culinary knowledge actually spreads. What we know with more certainty is that by the latter part of the 17th century, frozen desserts called cream ices had become fashionable among European aristocracy. These weren't the elaborate confections we think of today, but they were recognizably ice cream, sweetened cream or custard, frozen until it achieved a semi-solid state flavored with fruits, flowers or spices. The method for making them relied on understanding something that Europeans had only recently begun to grasp. That salt added to ice lowered the mixture's temperature below the freezing point of water. Authors in the 16th century made references to this refrigerant effect, noting it almost as a curiosity. By the 17th century, this knowledge had become practical, enabling the production of sorbets and ice creams through what became known as the pot freezer method. The process was straightforward but laborious. A cook would prepare the ice cream mixture, cream or custard, sweetened and flavoured, and pour it into a metal pot. This pot would then be nested inside a larger wooden bucket or tub filled with a mixture of crushed ice and salt. As the salt melted the ice, it created a super cold brine that drew heat from the inner pot. But simply placing the pot in the ice wasn't enough. The mixture had to be stirred constantly, scraped from the sides of the pot where it froze first, folded back into the centre to freeze evenly. This required someone to stand there, sometimes for hours, arm deep in freezing brine, stirring and scraping and stirring again. The work was cold, exhausting and monotonous. Small wonder that ice cream remained a luxury reserved for those wealthy enough to employ servants to do this work. French confectioners refined the pot freezer method, developing a covered pail with a handle called a sorbetière. The lid helped maintain the cold temperature inside, while the handle made it somewhat easier to manage the stirring process. Still, it was grueling work. A skilled confectioner might need 2 to 3 hours of constant stirring to produce a single batch of ice cream with the right consistency, smooth and creamy rather than icy and granular. The texture was everything. Ice cream that froze too quickly or wasn't stirred properly would form large ice crystals that made it grainy and unpleasant. The goal was to create tiny, almost imperceptible crystals suspended in the frozen cream, giving it a smooth, velvety texture that melted gently on the tongue. Achieving this required not just technique but feel, knowing when the mixture had reached the right consistency, when to scrape more aggressively, when to let it rest briefly before stirring again. The flavors of early European ice cream reflected what was available and valued. Vanilla, which had to be imported from far-off places at great expense, became prized for its ability to enhance and complement the cream's richness. Chocolate, equally expensive, created a darker, more intense ice cream. Fruit ices use seasonal berries, stone fruits, and citrus, capturing the essence of summer in frozen form. Some recipes called for flowers, rose petals, violets, elderflowers, steeped in the cream to impart their delicate perfumes. In England, cream ice appeared regularly at the table of King Charles I during the 17th century. There's a legend, almost certainly false, that Charles ordered his ice cream maker beheaded to prevent the secret recipe from becoming public. Like the Catherine de' Medici story, this tale reveals more about Victorian romanticism than historical fact. The real story was less dramatic. Ice cream slowly became more available as technique spread from kitchen to kitchen, chef to apprentice, household to household. What limited ice cream spread wasn't secrecy but practicality. You needed ice, which meant access to frozen ponds or lakes in winter, or the ability to purchase ice from those who harvested it. You needed salt, which was expensive in many regions. You needed the right equipment, metal pots that conducted cold well, wooden tubs that insulated, and you needed either servants willing to do the exhausting work of stirring or the determination to do it yourself. In America, ice cream arrived with the colonists, appearing in the colonists by the early 17th century. It remained a treat for the upper class until ice storage became more common. George Washington, according to records, spent approximately $200 on ice cream during the summer of 1790, a substantial sum that speaks to both his fondness for the treat and its considerable expense. After his death, inventory records of Mount Vernon revealed 2 pewter ice cream pots among his possessions. By the late 1700s, ice cream had begun to appear in commercial establishments. In 1777, a confectioner named Philip Lindsay placed what may have been the first ice cream advertisement in an American newspaper, the New York Gazette, announcing that ladies and gentlemen may be supplied with ice cream every day at his shop. The phrase "every day" was significant. It suggested a reliable supply of ice and the capacity to produce ice cream regularly, not just occasionally. But every day still meant during summer when ice from winter storage remained available. And even then, the ice cream had to be consumed quickly, within hours of being made. Without continuous refrigeration, it would melt back into cream. The pot freezer method could create ice cream, but it couldn't preserve it. The fundamental problem remained. Ice cream required ice. And ice was still seasonal, still limited, still expensive. What was needed was a way to make ice more abundant, more reliable, more accessible. Someone would need to figure out how to turn ice from a luxury into a commodity, from a seasonal treasure into a year-round resource. That someone was about to step onto history's stage, though his first attempt would end in spectacular failure. On a cold February morning in 1806, a young man named Frederick Tudor stood on the docks of Boston Harbor, watching workers load his ship with a cargo that seemed destined for disaster. The vessel was called the Favorite, and it was being filled with 130 tons of ice cut from his family's pond in Saugus, Massachusetts. Tudor was 23 years old, and he was about to attempt something that everyone around him considered absurd. Shipping ice to the Caribbean island of Martinique, where temperatures rarely dropped below a balmy 70 degrees. The Boston Gazette captured the general sentiment when it reported, "No joke, a vessel has cleared at the custom house for Martinique with a cargo of ice. We hope this will not prove to be a slippery speculation." The pun was intentional, the skepticism genuine. Who would buy ice in the tropics? How could it possibly survive the 3-week journey south? And even if some ice remained upon arrival, what would the inhabitants of Martinique, people who had never experienced winter, do with it? Tudor came from a prominent Boston Brahmin family. His father, William Tudor, was a wealthy lawyer who had served as George Washington's Judge Advocate General. The family had money, social standing, and connections. Young Frederick was expected to follow his older brother to Harvard, to pursue a gentleman's education and a respectable profession. Instead, he had quit school at 13, choosing to work on the family farm and in business rather than pursue formal learning. The idea had come to him gradually, sparked by childhood memories and observations. Wealthy Boston families like the Tudors harvested ice from their ponds each winter, storing it in ice houses, insulated structures, often underground, packed with sawdust or straw to keep the ice from melting. This stored ice made summer bearable, allowing them to enjoy cold drinks, preserve food, and make ice cream during the hot months. Tudor had travelled to Cuba and the American South with an ill brother and experienced the oppressive heat, the way it drained energy and made even simple tasks exhausting. He had thought, these people need ice. They don't know they need it yet, but once they taste it, they'll never want to be without it. The logistics seemed straightforward in theory. Ice was essentially free. It formed naturally on ponds every winter. Harvesting it required only labour, which was cheap. Ships regularly left Boston empty, heading south to pick up cargo in the West Indies, which meant transport could be arranged affordably. And Tudor had connections in the Caribbean through his brother William and cousin James Savage, whom he had sent ahead to secure monopoly rights from island governments. Reality proved far more complicated. Finding a ship willing to transport ice turned out to be the first obstacle. Sailors worried that melted ice would flood their vessels and cause them to sink. Insurance companies refused to cover such an unusual and risky cargo. In the end, Tudor had to purchase the favourite outright for $4,750, nearly half of the $10,000 he had raised in funding. The ice had to be packed carefully. Tudor used hay as insulation, layering it between the blocks and around the edges of the hold. It was an educated guess about what might work. Nobody had tried this before on a commercial scale. When the favourite finally departed on February 10th, Tudor was nervous but hopeful. He had given his sales agent strict instructions. Give the ice away to bartenders and drink vendors. Let people taste cold beverages for free. A man who has drank his drinks cold at the same expense for 1 week can never be presented with them warm again, Tudor had written, confident that the product would sell itself once people experienced it. 3 weeks later, when the favourite arrived at Saint-Pierre, Martinique's capital, Tudor's worst fears and the skeptics' predictions both came true, though not quite in the ways anyone had imagined. Much of the ice had indeed melted during the journey. The hay insulation only went so far under tropical sun, but some remained, and it was still recognisably ice. The problem wasn't the product's condition. The problem was that nobody knew what to do with it. William Tudor and James Savage had made little progress in convincing locals or securing proper storage. Tudor found the situation maddening. People would carry ice through the streets at noon, letting the sun melt it. They would put it in plates before their doors, then complain when il fond, it melts. One person put ice in a tub of water. Another, incredibly, tried to preserve it with salt, which only accelerated the melting. Their methods of keeping it are laughable, Tudor wrote in frustration. The ice house Tudor had envisioned hadn't been built. There was nowhere to store the ice properly, no way to demonstrate that it could be preserved long enough to be useful. The inhabitants of Martinique, having never experienced cold in their tropical home, simply didn't understand what ice was or why they should want it. Tudor managed to sell some ice, but at prices far below what he needed to break even. The venture lost him $4,500. Most people would have quit after such a disastrous debut. But Tudor possessed something more valuable than business acumen or capital, stubborn determination bordering on obsession. He sent another shipment to Cuba the following year, this time securing a monopoly from the Spanish government, a significant advantage, but he still lost money. His brother William, having seen enough, dropped out of the business to found the North American Review and co-found the Boston Athenaeum, choosing the safer path of literary and cultural pursuits. Frederick Tudor stubbornly persisted. Each failure taught him something new about ice storage, about insulation, about building ice houses in hot climates. He learned that ice houses needed thick walls, good drainage and shade. He discovered that sawdust worked better than hay or straw for insulation. He began building his own ice houses at destination ports rather than relying on local contractors who didn't understand the requirements. The learning curve was expensive. By 1812, Tudor's debts far outweighed his income. He spent parts of 1812 and 1813 in debtor's prison, a common fate in that era for those who couldn't pay their creditors. While imprisoned, he continued planning, scheming, figuring out ways to make the ice business work. By 1815, he had managed to borrow enough money to build a proper ice house in Havana, a double-shelled structure, 25 feet square, 19 feet in the interior, 16 feet high, capable of holding 150 tons of ice. That ice house changed everything. With proper storage, ice could be kept for months, not just weeks. Tudor could ship larger quantities knowing they wouldn't all melt before being sold. Customers could buy ice and keep it in their own smaller ice houses or containers. The product became practical, not just a momentary novelty. By 1821, Tudor finally turned a profit. His ice house in New Orleans had proven successful, demonstrating that ice could work in the hot, humid American South. He began expanding to other ports, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile. Each new market required building another ice house, educating customers, creating demand where none had existed. It was exhausting, expensive work, but gradually the business grew. The ice enabled something beyond just cold drinks, though that was significant enough. It made ice cream possible in places where ice cream had never existed before. Taverns and confectioners in Havana, New Orleans, and Charleston could now offer frozen desserts to their customers. The ice cream still had to be made using the laborious pot freezer method, still required constant stirring and patience, but at least the essential ingredient, ice, was now available year-round. Tudor's success attracted imitators and competitors. Other entrepreneurs saw the profits and decided to enter the ice trade. More ships began carrying ice south, creating a genuine industry where Tudor had once stood alone. The competition actually helped. It normalized the product, made ice seem less like an exotic curiosity and more like a standard commodity. But Tudor still had ambitions far beyond America and the Caribbean. He dreamed of shipping ice to India, to the British colonists sweltering in Calcutta and Bombay. It seemed impossible. India was 16,000 miles away, a journey of 4 months through tropical waters. Surely all the ice would melt long before arrival. In 1833, Tudor found a partner willing to try, Samuel Austin, a Boston merchant whose fleet already sailed regularly to Calcutta. On May 12th of that year, the brig Tuscany departed with 180 tons of ice packed carefully in sawdust. Tudor had refined his insulation techniques over decades of trial and error. The ice was cut into uniform blocks, stacked precisely with sawdust between each layer and around all edges, creating an insulated mass that would melt from the outside in, protecting the interior ice. 4 months later, when the Tuscany arrived in Calcutta, 100 tons of ice remained, more than half the original cargo. The British colonists, broiling in the Indian heat, were thrilled. They had grown up with ice in England, had missed it terribly in India's climate, and were willing to pay premium prices for this reminder of home. India became Tudor's most lucrative market, generating profits that finally made him wealthy. By the 1850s, Tudor's business was shipping 146,000 tons of ice annually to destinations that included Charleston, Savannah, Key West, New Orleans, Havana, Barbados, Buenos Aires, Valparaiso, Ceylon, Calcutta, Bombay, Singapore, Manila, Canton, and Australia. The Ice King, as Tudor had become known, had created a global industry from what had seemed like a ridiculous idea, and everywhere Tudor's ice went, ice cream followed. The frozen dessert that had once been limited to those with access to winter ice could now be enjoyed year-round in tropical climates. Confectioners opened ice cream parlors. Home cooks experimented with flavors. The pop freezer method remained laborious, but at least it was now possible in places it had never been before. Still, making ice cream remained back-breaking work. Someone would need to solve that problem next. In the summer of 1843, in the city of Philadelphia, a woman named Nancy Johnson was thinking about ice cream and the considerable effort required to make it. She had watched servants labor for hours over the pot freezer method, stirring endlessly while their arms grew tired and cold from reaching into the icy brine. She had made ice cream herself and knew the tedium of scraping frozen cream from metal walls, folding it back into liquid center, scraping and folding until finally, if you were lucky and persistent, you achieved something smooth enough to serve. There had to be a better way. Nancy Maria Donaldson Johnson was born in 1794, probably somewhere in New York State, though the exact location has been lost to time. She had married Walter Rogers Johnson, a natural scientist who would later play a prominent role in the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The couple lived in Philadelphia and had adopted 2 children. Nancy was involved with her sister Mary in the American Missionary Association, teaching and doing charitable work. She was not, by any conventional measure, an inventor. Yet on September 9, 1843, she received United States Patent number 3254 for an artificial freezer, a hand-cranked ice cream machine that would revolutionize how ice cream was made. The fact that Nancy filed the patent in her own name was itself remarkable. At that time, the legal principle of coverture meant that married women were considered the legal and economic dependents of their husbands. Most women inventors relied on male relatives to file patents on their behalf, as women often lacked the legal standing or financial independence to navigate the patent process alone. But Nancy Johnson put her own name on the application, asserting ownership of her invention with what must have been considerable determination. Her artificial freezer was elegantly simple. It consisted of a wooden tub, much like a butter churn, with a metal cylinder nested inside. Between the cylinder and the outer tub, ice and salt were packed, the same supercooling mixture that had been used for decades. The innovation lay inside the cylinder. Johnson designed a hand crank that extended through a lid connecting to a vertical shaft that ran down the center of the cylinder. Attached to this shaft were 2 curved perforated paddles. She called them beaters, shaped like the letter S. When you turned the crank, these beaters rotated inside the stationary cylinder. The curved edges would scrape the frozen cream from the cylinder walls and carry it toward the center, while the perforations allowed the mixture to flow through, ensuring even freezing. By turning the crank in one direction, the beaters pushed the mixture from center to edge. By turning it the other way, they scraped frozen matter from the walls and gathered it toward the center. This constant movement prevented large ice crystals from forming and incorporated air into the mixture, making the ice cream lighter and creamier than the pot freezer method could achieve. The genius was in the details. The lid kept the cold temperature contained, reducing the amount of ice needed and speeding up the freezing process. The beaters were perforated, which meant the mixture flowed through them as they moved, creating more thorough mixing than a solid paddle could achieve. The crank was positioned outside the tub, away from the freezing brine, so the operator's hands stayed dry and warm, and most importantly, the cylinder remained stationary while only the beaters moved, making the whole process more efficient and less physically demanding. In her patent application, Johnson explained the mechanics with precision. When the revolutions are made by carrying the hand from right to left between the axis and the operator, the vertical edges of the beater tend constantly to carry the liquid or semi-fluid mass from the center to the circumference of the containing cylinder. And on the contrary, when he turns the crank from left to right between himself and the shaft, it will tend to cut off any frozen matter from the inner surface of the freezer and to gather it toward the central parts, thus constantly allowing fresh portions of the cream or other substances to be frozen to come in contact with the refrigerating surface. She even included a practical tip for those concerned about expense. When the economy of salt is particularly important, I affect it by evaporating the salt water derived from the salt and ice, thus making a very limited quantity of salt serve for an indefinite number of successive operations. Nothing was wasted, nothing overlooked. The impact was immediate and transformative. What had taken hours of exhausting labor could now be accomplished in about 30 minutes of gentle cranking. A child could do it. An elderly person could do it. You didn't need servants or exceptional physical strength, just patience and a steady rhythm. The ice cream that emerged was better than what the pot freezer method produced. Smoother, airier, more consistent in texture. The perforated beaters incorporated tiny air bubbles that made the ice cream lighter and more pleasant on the tongue. Johnson successfully commercialized her invention, though she soon sold the patent to William Young for $1,500, the total sum she would receive for an invention that would change an entire industry. Young marketed it as the Johnson Patent Ice Cream Freezer, and it became widely popular across America. The timing was perfect. Frederick Tudor's ice trade had made ice available year-round in cities across America. Ice houses and ice boxes were becoming common even in middle-class homes. People had access to ice but still found ice cream making prohibitively difficult. Johnson's freezer solved that problem, democratizing ice cream in a way that nothing else had. Ice cream went from being a luxury for the wealthy to a treat that ordinary families could make at home. Other inventors immediately began working on variations and improvements. In England, Thomas Masters had filed a patent for a similar machine around the same time, dated July 6, 1843, but not enrolled until January 6, 1844, making Johnson's patent slightly earlier. By 1848, a New Jersey inventor named Eber Seaman had scaled up Johnson's basic design into a machine capable of producing ice cream on a commercial scale, which further lowered production costs and made ice cream even more accessible. Ice cream parlors began appearing in American cities and towns. These weren't just places to buy ice cream. They were social gathering spots, destinations for families on summer evenings, places where young couples could meet under the guise of enjoying a frozen treat. The flavors proliferated. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry became standards, but adventurous parlor owners experimented with everything from pistachio to peppermint, from maple to coffee. The hand-cranked freezer became a fixture of American life. Family gatherings often featured someone, usually a child or young adult, cranking the freezer while others waited eagerly for the ice cream to be ready. It became a ritual, a form of anticipation that made the eventual reward taste even better. You could hear the rhythmic sound of the crank, feel the resistance increase as the mixture thickened, know by the heaviness of the turning that the ice cream was almost ready. And still, the ice cream had to be eaten quickly. The freezer could make it, but once removed from the ice bath, the ice cream would begin to melt. You might have 30 minutes, perhaps an hour, if you were lucky, before it turned back into sweet cream. Ice cream remained a fresh product, made for immediate consumption. To keep it longer required something else, some way to maintain freezing temperatures continuously. That technology was still decades away. In the meantime, people made do with what they had. Ice harvested in winter, stored in ice houses through summer, used to make ice cream in machines that Nancy Johnson and others had designed. It was a system built on ingenuity and natural resources, on understanding the physics of salt and ice, on the simple pleasure of something cold and sweet on a hot day. The ice industry itself was approaching its peak. By the 1880s, an estimated 20,000 workers harvested ice from the Hudson River alone, storing it in 135 ice houses that lined the riverbanks between New York City and Albany. The work was dangerous. Men fell through ice, were struck by 100-pound blocks, became entangled in conveyor machinery. Local newspapers regularly reported accidents. Workers carried 10-foot poles horizontally to prevent being swept under the ice by swift currents if they fell through. But the pay was decent for seasonal work, about $1 per day, with an additional $2 if you bought a horse or donkey, the equivalent of $25 and $50 today. The ice harvesting industry employed men and women, African Americans, and Italian and Irish immigrants. It was one of the few industries that hired so diversely, creating a genuine melting pot of workers, united by the dangerous cold labor of cutting winter into blocks and storing it for summer. All of this, the ice houses, the harvest crews, the global shipping trade, the hand-cranked freezers, existed to make possible something as simple and delightful as ice cream. Humans had constructed an elaborate infrastructure of winter preservation just so they could have something cold and sweet when the weather turned warm. The system worked, but it was fragile, dependent on weather and winter, on lakes freezing thick enough and staying frozen long enough. A mild winter could devastate the ice crop. Climate variations affected supply and prices. Everyone understood that this couldn't last forever, that eventually someone would figure out how to make ice artificially, mechanically, without depending on winter's cooperation. That future was approaching faster than anyone realized. While ice harvesters worked the frozen surfaces of northern lakes and rivers, scientists and engineers were pursuing a different approach to the problem of cold. If ice could be created artificially, through mechanical means rather than waiting for winter, then the entire elaborate system of harvesting, storing, and shipping natural ice could be replaced with something more reliable and controllable. The understanding of thermodynamics was still developing in the early 19th century, but certain principles were becoming clear. Heat was a form of energy that could be moved from one place to another. If you could force heat to leave a substance, that substance would cool down. The challenge was figuring out how to accomplish this mechanically, repeatedly, and efficiently. Early attempts at artificial ice making were expensive, unreliable, and often dangerous. Various inventors experimented with different refrigerants, substances that could absorb heat by evaporating, then be condensed back into liquid form by compression, releasing that heat elsewhere. Ether, ammonia, sulfur dioxide, each had advantages and significant drawbacks. Ether was flammable. Ammonia was toxic. Sulfur dioxide was corrosive. The machines themselves were massive, complicated contraptions of pipes and compressors that broke down frequently and required constant maintenance. In 1870, a German engineer named Carl von Linde developed a process for industrial refrigeration that was more reliable than previous attempts. His ammonia compression refrigeration system could produce cold continuously, making ice without any dependence on winter weather. The technology was initially used for breweries. Beer production required careful temperature control, and brewers were willing to invest in expensive equipment to achieve consistent quality. But the implications extended far beyond beer. By the late 19th century, artificial ice plants were beginning to appear in cities, competing directly with the natural ice trade. The artificial ice, called plant ice, had certain advantages. It was cleaner than natural ice, which could contain sediment, algae, or pollutants from the lakes and ponds where it was harvested. It was available year-round regardless of weather, and it could be produced near the point of use, eliminating the need for long-distance shipping. But plant ice was initially expensive to produce. The machines required coal or other fuel to run, needed skilled operators, and broke down with frustrating regularity. Natural ice, by contrast, was essentially free except for labor costs. A mild winter might reduce supply, but a cold winter produced abundance that could be stored for months. For decades, the two systems coexisted, competing and sometimes complementing each other. In Australia and India during the 1850s and 70s, plant ice began successfully competing with natural ice. The distances involved in shipping natural ice to these locations were so great, and the losses from melting so substantial, that locally produced artificial ice made economic sense despite the higher production costs. British colonists in India, who had eagerly embraced Frederick Tudor's ice shipments, gradually shifted to locally made plant ice as the technology improved. But in America and Europe, natural ice remained dominant through the end of the 19th century. The ice harvesting industry had become enormous, employing 90,000 people at its peak, with ice houses capable of storing up to 250,000 tons each. The infrastructure was in place, the methods were refined, and the economics still favored natural ice for most applications. For ice cream makers, the source of ice mattered less than its availability. Whether harvested from a frozen lake or produced in a refrigeration plant, ice served the same purpose. When mixed with salt, it created the super cold brine necessary to freeze cream in hand-cranked machines. Commercial ice cream parlors used increasingly large quantities, and they bought from whatever source was cheapest and most reliable. The hand-cranked freezer had democratized ice cream making at home, but it hadn't changed the fundamental challenge of preservation. Ice cream still melted quickly once made. Parlors had to produce it fresh throughout the day, keeping it in containers surrounded by ice and salt, knowing it would only last a few hours at best. Home ice cream makers learned to time their production so the ice cream was ready exactly when guests arrived for dinner or a party. Some creative solutions emerged. A few wealthy households had dedicated ice cream rooms, small chambers kept cold by blocks of ice, where frozen desserts could be stored for slightly longer periods. Commercial establishments sometimes kept ice cream in metal containers nested in larger ice-filled boxes, extending its life by a few precious hours. But these were workarounds, not solutions. Ice cream remained stubbornly ephemeral, a treat that existed in the moment and then was gone. The first truly practical solution came in the early 20th century with the development of continuous process freezers, industrial machines that could produce ice cream in large quantities and maintain it at freezing temperatures. These machines, powered by the same refrigeration technology that made plant ice, revolutionized commercial ice cream production. Instead of making small batches that had to be sold within hours, manufacturers could produce ice cream continuously, store it frozen, and distribute it widely. In 1926, a crucial development occurred. The continuous refrigeration process was perfected for commercial use, enabling industrial manufacturers to produce ice cream on a truly massive scale. The price of ice cream plummeted. What had been a special treat became an everyday commodity. By the 1930s, ice cream had become so affordable and available that it served as a form of cheap comfort during the Great Depression, a small luxury that even struggling families could sometimes afford. The electric home refrigerator, introduced in 1913, took longer to become common. Early models were unreliable and expensive, more trouble than they were worth for most families. The Domelry domestic electric refrigerator, released in 1914, was a small cooling device that could be used in any icebox to replace the ice itself. It offered more careful temperature regulation, but the market wasn't ready. The technology was neither reliable enough nor affordable enough to compete with the simple efficiency of an icebox filled with a block of natural or plant ice. Manufacturers experimented with various designs throughout the 1910s and 20s, gradually improving reliability and reducing costs. The General Electric monitor-top refrigerator, introduced in 1927, became the first model to achieve widespread popularity in American homes. It looked like a regular refrigerator with a cylindrical unit on top containing the compressor and cooling mechanism. It was quieter, more reliable, and more affordable than previous models, though still expensive enough that many families continued using iceboxes well into the 1930s. For ice cream, the home refrigerator changed everything. Suddenly, you could make ice cream and keep it frozen for days or weeks rather than hours. You could buy ice cream at a store and bring it home, knowing it wouldn't melt before you got there. The freezer compartment in these early refrigerators wasn't very large and didn't get as cold as modern freezers, but it was cold enough for ice cream. The icebox itself deserves mention in this story, as it represented an intermediate technology that made refrigeration accessible before electricity. These were insulated wooden cabinets, usually lined with tin or zinc, with a compartment at the top for a large block of ice. The ice would slowly melt, and the cold air it produced would sink down into the storage compartments below, keeping food cool. Every few days, the Iceman would deliver a fresh block to replace what had melted. The Iceman became a familiar figure in American neighborhoods from the late 19th century through the early 20th. He would drive a horse-drawn wagon, later a motorized truck filled with ice blocks of various sizes. Households would place cards in their windows indicating how much ice they needed, 25, 50 or 100 pounds. The Iceman would chip off a block of the appropriate size, hoist it onto his shoulder using special tongs, and carry it into the house to load into the icebox. Children loved the Iceman's visits, especially in summer. They would gather around his wagon and he would chip off small pieces of ice for them to suck on, a simple pleasure on hot days, free and refreshing. The ice itself was often beautifully clear, cut into perfect rectangular blocks glistening in the sun as the Iceman made his rounds. The transition from ice boxes to electric refrigerators happened gradually over several decades. In 1930, only 8% of American homes had electric refrigerators. By 1944, that number had risen to 44%. The ice delivery business slowly declined, and the last icemen made their final rounds in the 1960s in some areas, though a few continued even later in rural regions without reliable electricity. For ice cream, each technological advance expanded possibilities. The yakhchāls of ancient Persia made ice cream possible in the desert. The ice trade made it possible in tropical climates. The hand-cranked freezer made it possible at home. Industrial refrigeration made it available year-round in shops. And the home freezer made it a permanent fixture in American kitchens, always available, never melting away before you could enjoy it. Yet something was lost in this progression toward convenience and abundance. The ritual of making ice cream together, taking turns cranking the freezer, waiting with anticipation as the mixture slowly thickened. This became less common as store-bought ice cream became more available. The connection between the labor of making and the pleasure of eating gradually faded. But the story of how ice cream survived without refrigeration, how it existed for thousands of years before electric freezers, remains a testament to human creativity and determination. People wanted something cold and sweet badly enough to build ice houses in the desert, to ship frozen water across oceans, to spend hours cranking machines in the summer heat. They wanted it enough to make it happen, generation after generation, each building on the innovations of those who came before. Before we follow ice cream into its fully modern era, it's worth pausing to understand the chemistry that made all of this possible. The simple but essential science of salt and ice that enabled frozen desserts to exist centuries before anyone understood why it worked. Water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. This is a fact so familiar that it seems unremarkable, but it's actually quite specific to pure water. When you dissolve something in water, salt, sugar, alcohol, anything that breaks down into particles suspended in the liquid, the freezing point drops. The water no longer freezes at 32 degrees. It requires a colder temperature, sometimes much colder, depending on what's dissolved in it and how much. This phenomenon is called freezing point depression, and it's one of several colligative properties, characteristics that depend on the number of dissolved particles rather than what those particles actually are. 10,000 sugar molecules dissolved in water will lower the freezing point by the same amount as 10,000 salt particles, assuming both dissolve completely. The type of molecule matters less than the quantity, but there's a crucial difference between salt and sugar in practice. Common table salt, sodium chloride, splits into two particles when it dissolves, one sodium ion and one chloride ion. Sugar molecules stay intact. This means that gram for gram salt is roughly twice as effective at lowering the freezing point as sugar is, because each salt molecule becomes two particles in solution. The mathematics of freezing point depression can be calculated with a straightforward formula involving the molality of the solution, the number of particles per kilogram of solvent, and a constant specific to the solvent. For water, that constant is approximately 1.853 degrees Celsius per mole of particles. But you didn't need to know the formula to make it work. People used salt and ice together for centuries before anyone could explain why it worked. What happens when you pack salt and ice together is this. The salt begins to dissolve in the thin layer of liquid water that exists on the surface of ice, even below freezing. As it dissolves, it disrupts the organized crystal structure of the ice, forcing the ice to absorb heat energy from its surroundings to melt. This paradoxically makes everything colder. The ice-salt mixture can reach temperatures well below 0 degrees Celsius, as low as -21 degrees Celsius with the right proportions of salt and ice. This is cold enough to freeze cream, which has a lower freezing point than pure water because of all the dissolved and suspended substances it contains: milk proteins, fat globules, sugar, and whatever flavorings have been added. A typical ice cream mixture might freeze at around -3 degrees Celsius, though the exact temperature depends on the recipe. The ice-salt brine at -10 or -15 degrees provides more than enough cold to freeze the mixture, but freezing isn't enough by itself. If you simply put a container of cream in a tub of ice-salt brine and left it alone, you'd get a solid block of frozen cream, hard, icy, and unpleasant to eat. The magic of ice cream lies in the texture, and achieving the right texture requires constant agitation during freezing. When cream freezes slowly without stirring, large ice crystals form. Water molecules have time to organize themselves into neat, orderly crystals, and these crystals grow larger as more water freezes onto them. Large crystals make the ice cream grainy, icy, unpleasant on the tongue. But when the mixture is stirred constantly during freezing, the ice crystals never have time to grow large. They form tiny, barely perceptible crystals suspended throughout the mixture. The stirring also incorporates air. Each rotation of Nancy Johnson's perforated paddles, each scraping motion in the old pot freezer method, folded tiny air bubbles into the mixture. These bubbles became trapped as the mixture froze, creating a lighter texture. Modern commercial ice cream can be up to 50% air by volume, though traditional recipes had less. The air made the ice cream easier to scoop, softer on the tongue, more pleasant to eat. The fat in cream played its own role. Cream is an emulsion. Tiny droplets of milk fat suspended in water, stabilized by proteins. When you churn the mixture while it freezes, you partially break down this emulsion. Some of the fat droplets cluster together, creating a network that traps air bubbles and ice crystals. This gives ice cream its characteristic structure. Ice crystals, air bubbles, and fat clusters all suspended in a matrix of concentrated sugar solution and milk proteins. The sugar does more than sweeten. Because it lowers the freezing point, some of the water in ice cream never freezes at all, even at typical freezer temperatures. This unfrozen sugar solution keeps the ice cream from becoming rock hard. It's what allows ice cream to remain scoopable at temperatures that would turn pure water into solid ice. Too much sugar and the ice cream won't freeze properly. Too little and it becomes too hard to serve. The balance matters. Different ingredients contributed different properties. Vanilla contained compounds that enhanced the perception of creaminess. Chocolate added cocoa butter, another fat that affected texture. Fruit added both sugar and acid, which changed how the mixture froze. Eggs, used in custard-based ice creams, contributed proteins that helped stabilize the structure and create an even richer texture. The Persian addition of salep, that powder made from orchid tubers, worked because it contained glucomannan, a polysaccharide that absorbed water and created a gel-like network. This prevented ice crystals from growing large and gave the ice cream an elastic, stretchy quality. Mastic contributed similar effects through different chemistry, plus it added flavor. These weren't random additions, but sophisticated responses to the challenge of texture. All of this happened in hand-cranked freezers across America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in ice cream parlors in cities and towns, in home kitchens where families made dessert for Sunday dinner. Most people didn't know the chemistry. They just knew that ice and salt made things cold enough to freeze cream, and that stirring while freezing made better ice cream than not stirring. The knowledge was empirical, passed down through practice and experimentation. A cook might learn that using too much salt wasted money without making the ice colder. There was a limit to how low the temperature could go. They might discover that adding the salt too quickly caused the ice to melt faster without maintaining temperature as long. Small adjustments in technique, accumulated over time, refined the process. Commercial ice cream makers in the early 20th century began to understand the science more explicitly. They could calculate optimal sugar concentrations for different serving temperatures. They could experiment with different stabilizers and emulsifiers to improve texture and shelf life. They could control aging times, letting the mixture rest before freezing, which allowed proteins and fats to interact in ways that improved the final product. But even as the science became clearer, the fundamental process remained recognizable. You started with cream, milk, sugar, and flavoring. You surrounded it with something colder than its freezing point, whether ice, salt, brine, mechanical refrigeration, or liquid nitrogen in modern molecular gastronomy experiments. You agitated it during freezing to control crystal size and incorporate air, and you ended up with something cold, smooth, sweet, and delightful. The transition from natural ice to mechanical refrigeration didn't change this basic process. It just changed where the cold came from. Instead of harvesting winter and storing it in sawdust-insulated warehouses, you produced cold on demand by compressing and expanding refrigerant gases. The effect was the same: heat removed, temperature lowered, cream frozen. By the 1930s, most commercial ice cream in America was made with mechanical refrigeration. The ice harvest was in terminal decline, undermined by the reliability and consistency of plant ice and mechanical freezers. The last major ice harvest on Maine's Kennebec River happened in February 1919. Some northern farmers continued putting up ice for their own use into the 1940s, especially in areas without electricity, but the commercial trade was essentially over. The infrastructure that had supported it, the ice houses lining the Hudson River, the ships specially designed to carry ice, the global network of storage facilities, gradually disappeared. Some ice houses were converted to other uses or torn down for their lumber. Others simply decayed, returning to the landscape. Today, few physical traces remain of an industry that once employed tens of thousands and shipped millions of tons annually. But the knowledge embedded in that industry persisted. The understanding of insulation, of drainage, of the importance of preventing melting ice from contacting stored ice. These principles found new applications. Modern cold storage facilities use different technologies but address the same fundamental challenges that builders of ice houses once solved with sawdust and careful construction. For ice cream, the shift to mechanical refrigeration meant abundance and consistency. No more mild winters causing ice shortages and price spikes. No more limiting production to what could be made and sold within hours. Ice cream could be manufactured continuously, stored indefinitely, and distributed widely. The industry exploded. By 1946, after World War II ended and dairy rationing was lifted, Americans consumed over 20 quarts of ice cream per person annually. Ice cream parlors proliferated. New flavors emerged. Rocky Road, invented during the Great Depression, combined chocolate ice cream with marshmallows and nuts. Neapolitan layered vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry in striped blocks. Butter pecan added the richness of caramelized nuts. The variety seemed endless. Yet all of it, every flavor, every innovation, every scoop served, rested on the foundation built by those who had figured out how to make ice cream without refrigeration. The Persian engineers who built yakhchāls, the Chinese who harvested lake ice and mixed it with milk and rice, Frederick Tudor shipping winter to the tropics, Nancy Johnson designing a better machine, all of them solving the same problem: how to make something frozen in a warm world. The story of ice cream is also a story of the people who made it, sold it and perfected it, individuals whose names are sometimes remembered and often forgotten, but whose contributions shaped what ice cream became. Among them was a man named Augustus Jackson, who worked in the White House kitchens in the 1820s and then brought his skills to the streets of Philadelphia. Jackson was born into slavery, though the exact details of his early life remain unclear. a common tragedy of the historical record, which preserved the lives of the wealthy in detail while leaving gaps where the stories of enslaved and working people should be. What we know is that by the 1820s he was working as a chef in the White House during James Monroe's presidency, preparing meals for the president and his guests, including occasional frozen desserts. After leaving the White House, Jackson moved to Philadelphia and started his own catering business. He became known for his ice cream, which he sold in tin cans to other vendors and to ice cream parlors throughout the city. Jackson didn't invent ice cream, despite later exaggerations that called him the father of ice cream, but he did innovate in important ways. He developed methods for controlling the freezing of custard more precisely, creating smoother textures than many of his competitors achieved. He experimented with flavors, moving beyond simple vanilla and fruit ices to more complex combinations. His business model was clever. Rather than operating a single parlor that required customers to come to him, he manufactured ice cream in quantity and distributed it to multiple vendors. This allowed him to reach more customers and build a larger business than a single storefront could support. The tin cans he used helped insulate the ice cream during transport, packed in ice and salt to keep them frozen during delivery. Jackson's success spoke to a larger truth. Ice cream making was skilled labor that created opportunities for those who mastered it. In a society that severely limited opportunities for African Americans, both free and enslaved, ice cream represented one of the few trades where skill and quality could sometimes overcome racial barriers. Customers cared about how the ice cream tasted, about its texture and freshness, and would buy from whoever made the best product. Across the Atlantic, in Italy, ice cream was following its own evolutionary path. Italian gelato had developed distinct characteristics that set it apart from American ice cream. It used more milk and less cream, resulting in lower fat content. It was churned more slowly, incorporating less air, which made it denser and more intensely flavored. And it was served at slightly warmer temperatures, typically around minus 13 degrees Celsius compared to the minus 18 degrees common for American ice cream. These weren't arbitrary differences, but deliberate choices that reflected different culinary philosophies. Italian gelato makers, Galatieri, saw their craft as emphasizing pure, intense flavors. The lower fat content meant that flavors came through more clearly, not muffled by cream's richness. The denser texture created a different sensation on the tongue, substantial rather than airy. The warmer serving temperature allowed flavors to express themselves more fully. Cold numbs taste buds, and extremely cold ice cream loses some of its flavor subtlety. Small gelaterias began appearing throughout Italy in the 19th century, each with its own recipes and specialties. Pistachio gelato from Sicily incorporated the island's distinctive pistachios, bright green and intensely flavored. Stracciatella, chocolate chip gelato, was invented by mixing melted chocolate into vanilla gelato as it froze, creating irregular ribbons and chips of chocolate throughout. Hazelnut gelato celebrated another Italian specialty, the rich hazelnuts from Piedmont. These gelaterias were family operations, with recipes and techniques passed from parent to child, apprentice to master. The best gelatieri developed reputations that drew customers from across their cities. Making gelato was considered a genuine craft, requiring years to master fully. You had to understand how different ingredients affected freezing, how to balance sweetness and richness, how to achieve the signature dense but smooth texture that distinguished excellent gelato from merely good gelato. In America, ice cream was becoming more democratic and commercial. Ice cream parlors were social spaces, but they were also businesses focused on volume and variety. The American preference leaned toward richness and abundance, more cream, more air, more toppings. Banana splits, invented in 1904 in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, epitomized this approach. 3 scoops of ice cream with banana, chocolate sauce, pineapple, strawberries, whipped cream, nuts, and a cherry on top. It was exuberant, excessive, delightful in its over-the-top abundance. The ice cream cone, too, emerged from this spirit of innovation and commercialization. The popular legend places its invention at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, where a vendor supposedly ran out of serving dishes and began rolling up waffles to hold ice cream. Like many origin stories, this one is more myth than history. Recent research has shown that ice cream cones were an English invention, appearing in England before the St. Louis Fair. But the fair certainly popularized cones in America. Visitors to the fair could walk around eating ice cream without needing to return a dish. which made the fair's crowded walkways easier to navigate. The cone became the quintessential portable ice cream delivery system, edible, convenient, and adding its own sweet crunch to complement the cold cream. The 1920s brought another innovation, the ice cream truck. Vendors had sold ice cream from carts for decades, but motorized trucks allowed them to cover larger territories and keep ice cream frozen longer. With better insulated compartments, the trucks would drive through neighborhoods, often playing music or ringing bells to announce their presence. Children would hear the sound and beg their parents for coins to buy ice cream bars, popsicles, or cones from the cheerful vendor. These trucks became part of the soundtrack of American summers. Different trucks had different songs. Turkey in the Straw was common, though the tune carried unfortunate associations with minstrel shows that vendors were mostly unaware of. What mattered was the sound itself, the Pavlovian response it triggered. The ice cream truck is here, summer is here, something cold and sweet is available right now if you hurry. Novelties proliferated. The Eskimo pie, vanilla ice cream coated in chocolate, invented in 1921, became wildly popular. The Klondike bar followed a similar concept with a thicker chocolate coating and square shape. Popsicles, invented accidentally when a boy left a mixture of powdered soda and water with a stirring stick outside on a cold night, offered a simpler frozen treat. Ice cream sandwiches placed ice cream between two cookies or wafers. Drumsticks combined a cone with chocolate and nuts. Each innovation addressed practical concerns while adding delight. The chocolate coating on an Eskimo pie kept the ice cream from melting onto your hands as quickly. The stick on a popsicle gave you something to hold. The cookies on an ice cream sandwich absorbed any melting that occurred. But these were also treats that made people smile, that combined textures and flavors in playful ways. During Prohibition from 1920 to 1933, ice cream parlors gained new significance. With bars and saloons closed, soda fountains and ice cream parlors became important social gathering places. The soda jerk, the person who operated the soda fountain, making ice cream sodas, sundaes, and other concoctions, became a recognized profession. These weren't just servers but performers, flipping scoops of ice cream through the air, creating elaborate sundaes with flourishes and style, chatting with regular customers who came in daily. The Great Depression, paradoxically, was good for ice cream. When money was tight and spirits were low, ice cream offered affordable comfort. A nickel cone or a dime sundae provided a moment of pleasure, a brief escape from hardship. Families who couldn't afford much else could sometimes afford ice cream. The industry continued growing even as other sectors contracted. World War II created different challenges. Dairy products were rationed, making ice cream temporarily scarce for civilians. But the military recognized ice cream's morale value. Each branch tried to outdo the others in providing ice cream to troops. In 1945, the Navy built the first floating ice cream parlor, a barge equipped with ice cream making equipment to serve sailors in the Western Pacific. The image of American servicemen enjoying ice cream while at war became part of the war's mythology, a symbol of the abundance and comfort they were fighting to preserve. When the war ended and rationing lifted, America celebrated with ice cream. Consumption soared. New parlors opened. Existing manufacturers expanded production. The soldiers who had enjoyed ice cream during the war wanted it at home, and the economy was strong enough to support their appetites. Ice cream became firmly embedded in American culture, associated with celebration, childhood, summer, and simple pleasures. Through all of this, the innovations, the commercialization, the cultural significance, the basic process remained rooted in principles established centuries earlier. You needed cold, you needed cream or milk, you needed sweetness and flavor, and you needed to understand that the way you froze the mixture mattered as much as what you were freezing. The people who made ice cream, whether Persian cooks in ancient yakhchāls, Italian gelatori in family shops, or Augustus Jackson in Philadelphia, were practitioners of a craft that combined art and science. They worked with their hands and their judgment, learning through repetition what temperatures felt right, when the mixture was ready, how to adjust for the weather or the specific ingredients available that day. Even as machines became more sophisticated and production more industrialized, the best ice cream still required this kind of attention and skill. Mass production could make ice cream abundant and affordable, but it couldn't quite match what a skilled artisan could create with good ingredients and patient care. By the mid-20th century, ice cream had become so thoroughly woven into the fabric of everyday life that it was easy to forget how improbable its existence had once been. Children growing up in the 1950s and 60s knew ice cream as something that simply existed in freezers, available whenever you wanted it, in flavors limited only by imagination and marketing budgets. The elaborate infrastructure that made this possible, the chemistry, the engineering, the centuries of accumulated knowledge, had become invisible, taken for granted. But in some corners of the world, older methods persisted, keeping alive the connection between effort and reward. In parts of Iran, a few remaining yakhchāls still stood, though most had fallen into disuse or been abandoned entirely. The ones that survived did so as monuments, preserved for their historical and architectural significance rather than practical function. Tourists could visit them, walk into the cool underground chambers, marvel at the thick walls and the ingenious ventilation systems. But they no longer stored ice for summer use. Refrigeration had arrived even in the Iranian desert, rendering these magnificent structures obsolete. In small Italian towns, traditional gelaterias continued making gelato by hand, resisting the tide of industrialization. These shops remained family operations, third or fourth generation gelaterie carrying on methods their grandparents had used. They still made gelato fresh daily, still adjusted recipes based on the quality of ingredients available that day, still took pride in the craft of balancing flavors and achieving perfect texture. For them, gelato wasn't just a product, but an expression of culture, tradition, and care. American ice cream, meanwhile, had split into two distinct streams. On one side was industrial ice cream, mass-produced, widely distributed, optimized for shelf life and profitability. Brands like Breyers, Baskin-Robbins with its famous 31 flavors, and Howard Johnson's competed for shelf space in grocery store freezers. These companies employed food scientists who understood the chemistry of ice cream in extraordinary detail, who could formulate recipes that would remain stable through temperature fluctuations during shipping, that would scoop easily even after weeks in a freezer, that would deliver consistent flavor and texture batch after batch. On the other side was a growing artisanal movement harking back to older traditions of quality and care. Small batch ice cream makers emphasized local ingredients, creative flavors, and traditional techniques. They made ice cream the way Nancy Johnson might have recognized, though with better equipment and deeper scientific understanding. They sourced cream from specific dairies, used real vanilla beans instead of extract, incorporated fresh fruit at peak ripeness. The ice cream cost more, but it tasted different, more intense, more complex, more connected to the ingredients and the season. This split reflected a larger tension in American food culture. The industrial food system had delivered abundance and convenience beyond anything previous generations could have imagined. You could buy ice cream in January in Minnesota, could choose from dozens of flavors, could trust that it would be safe and consistent. This was genuinely remarkable, genuinely worth celebrating. The hunger and food insecurity that had plagued earlier eras had been largely conquered, at least in wealthy nations. But something had been lost in that triumph. The connection between food and season, between effort and appreciation, between craft and consumption, these had grown attenuated. Ice cream in January didn't feel special because ice cream was always available. The particular delight of something frozen on a hot summer day was diluted when you could have the same thing on a cold winter night. Abundance created its own kind of poverty, a poverty of meaning and connection. The artisanal ice cream movement represented an attempt to recover what had been lost without giving up what had been gained. These ice cream makers didn't want to return to the days when ice cream was scarce and expensive, when making it required hours of hand cranking, but they did want to preserve the sense that ice cream was something special, something worth paying attention to and savoring. Some of them experimented with unusual flavors that pushed the boundaries of what ice cream could be. Lavender honey, olive oil and sea salt, black sesame, goat cheese and red cherries. These weren't novelties for novelty's sake, but serious attempts to explore ice cream's potential, to treat it as a culinary medium capable of sophistication and complexity. The frozen cream became a canvas for flavor combinations that would have astonished Persian ice cream makers or Victorian confectioners. Others focused on perfecting classics, making the best possible vanilla or chocolate ice cream through careful attention to every detail. They learned that different vanilla beans from different regions, Madagascar versus Tahiti versus Mexico, produced distinctly different flavors. They discovered that the percentage of cocoa in chocolate dramatically affected the final ice cream, as did whether the chocolate was melted into the base or chopped and folded in. These were the lessons that professional ice cream makers had always known, but now a new generation was rediscovering them. The late 20th century also saw the emergence of ice cream as a vehicle for nostalgia and regional identity. Ben & Jerry's, founded in Vermont in 1978, built a brand around chunky, flavorful ice cream with playful names and countercultural credentials. Their ice cream was rich, packed with mix-ins, cookies, candy, brownie chunks, and marketed with a sense of humor and social consciousness. It occupied a middle ground between industrial and artisanal, bringing some artisanal sensibility to a larger scale. Regional ice cream companies thrived by emphasizing local pride and tradition. Bluebell in Texas, Grater's in Ohio, Tillamook in Oregon, each cultivated loyal followings by connecting their ice cream to place and heritage. Eating their ice cream became a way of affirming regional identity, of claiming allegiance to a particular corner of the country's geography and culture. The science of ice cream continued advancing as well. Researchers studied ice crystal formation at the molecular level, seeking to understand exactly what made some ice cream smoother than others. They investigated the role of different stabilizers and emulsifiers, finding ways to improve texture and shelf life without sacrificing quality. They experimented with serving temperatures, discovering that ice cream consumed at -12 degrees Celsius tasted different from the same ice cream at -15 degrees. The warmer temperature allowed flavors to express themselves more fully. Some innovations pushed into unexpected territory. Molecular gastronomy, emerging in the late 20th century, treated ice cream as an opportunity for scientific experimentation. Chefs began making ice cream with liquid nitrogen, which at -196 degrees Celsius froze the mixture almost instantaneously. This ultra-rapid freezing created exceptionally small ice crystals and an extraordinarily smooth texture. It also created dramatic presentations with billowing clouds of nitrogen vapor, adding visual spectacle to the dessert. The use of liquid nitrogen connected back, in a way, to the fundamental principle that had made ice cream possible millennia earlier. Cold freezes things, and colder freezes them differently. The Persian engineers who built yakhchāls understood this intuitively. The Sultan ice brine makers of the 18th century discovered it empirically. Modern ice cream scientists could explain it with thermodynamics and phase diagrams, but the basic insight remained constant across time and culture. As the 21st century arrived, ice cream faced new challenges and opportunities. Climate change, the same warming that was making winters milder and ice harvests impossible even if anyone still wanted to harvest ice, created pressure to reduce the environmental impact of dairy farming. Plant-based ice creams made from coconut milk, almond milk, oat milk, and other non-dairy bases began appearing, attempting to recreate ice cream's texture and pleasure without the climate cost of dairy. Some of these alternatives succeeded better than others. Coconut milk, with its high fat content, produced ice cream that was rich and creamy, though always with a subtle coconut flavor that didn't suit every taste. Oat milk created surprisingly good ice cream, with a neutral flavor that allowed other ingredients to shine. Almond milk was trickier, lower in fat. It required more stabilizers and careful formulation to achieve good texture. The challenge was the same one that ice cream makers had always faced: how to control ice crystal formation, how to create smoothness and richness, how to balance all the elements into something delightful. The tools had changed: modern stabilizers, homogenizers, blast freezers, but the fundamental task remained recognizable to anyone who had ever made ice cream, whether in ancient Persia or colonial America or modern Vermont. Ice cream had survived and thrived through extraordinary changes in technology, culture, and understanding. It had gone from a luxury reserved for royalty and the extremely wealthy to a treat available to nearly everyone in developed nations. It had traveled from Persia to China to Europe to the Americas, adapting to each new culture while maintaining its essential character. It had weathered the transition from natural ice to mechanical refrigeration, from hand cranking to industrial production, from simple flavors to elaborate creations. Through all of this, ice cream remained what it had always been: cream frozen with care, sweetened and flavored, churned to smoothness, cold enough to make you shiver on the hottest day. The pleasure it provided was simple and profound, unchanged by all the complexity that surrounded its production. A child eating an ice cream cone in the 21st century experienced the same basic delight that a Persian noble had felt tasting bustani, that George Washington had enjoyed at Mount Vernon, that workers had savored after a long day harvesting ice from frozen lakes. The story of how ice cream survived without refrigeration was ultimately a story about human creativity in the face of limitations. When you wanted something badly enough, something cold, something sweet, something delightful, you found a way to make it happen. You built structures to capture winter. You shipped frozen water across oceans. You cranked machines until your arms ached. You experimented with ingredients and techniques until you discovered what worked. And when new technologies arrived that made the old methods obsolete, you adapted, carrying forward the knowledge and craft while embracing new possibilities. The yakhchāls might be empty now, the ice harvesters long since retired, the hand-cranked freezers relegated to antique shops and nostalgia, but the understanding they represented, that cold could be captured and preserved, that pleasure was worth pursuing, that ingenuity could overcome obstacles, this remained alive in every scoop of ice cream produced and consumed. On a warm evening in the present day, somewhere in the world, someone is making ice cream. Perhaps it's a gelatier in Rome, preparing tomorrow's batch of pistachio gelato, using techniques passed down through generations. Perhaps it's a parent in suburban America pulling out an electric ice cream maker to teach their children how cream becomes something frozen and wonderful. Perhaps it's a vendor in India, hand-churning kulfi flavored with cardamom and saffron, the same flavors that delighted Mughal emperors centuries ago. The methods vary, the equipment differs, the specific flavors reflect different cultures and preferences, but the essential act remains unchanged, taking something liquid and transforming it into something frozen, creating pleasure from cream and cold and human attention. If you could somehow gather all the people who have ever made ice cream, the Persian engineers, the Chinese ice workers, the Italian gelatieri, the American parlor owners, the scientists in modern food laboratories, they would recognize each other's work despite the centuries and distances that separated them. They would understand the challenges each faced and appreciate the solutions each discovered. The conversation would flow easily across time and culture because they all worked on the same fundamental problem. That problem was never simply, how do we make ice cream? The real question was always deeper. How do we create something delightful in the face of obstacles? How do we preserve something fleeting? How do we share pleasure despite limitations of technology, climate, and resources? The Persian engineers who built yakhchāls answered by learning to make ice where ice shouldn't exist, capturing cold from the night sky through patient observation of evaporation and radiation. Their massive dome structures rising from the desert were monuments to the conviction that human ingenuity could overcome natural limits. They believed that wanting something badly enough, cool refreshment in scorching heat, frozen desserts in summer, justified years of experimentation and construction. They were right. Frederick Tudor answered by seeing value where others saw absurdity, by persisting through failure after failure until he learned how to ship winter across the world. His stubbornness transformed ice from a seasonal luxury into a global commodity. He failed more than he succeeded, spent time in debtor's prison, lost fortunes before making one, but he kept going because he believed the world wanted ice badly enough to make the venture worthwhile. He was right too. Nancy Johnson answered by paying attention to inefficiency and imagining something better. She watched people labor for hours over pot freezers and thought, there must be an easier way. Her hand-cranked machine didn't just make ice cream production faster, it democratized the entire enterprise, making what had been a luxury accessible to ordinary families. She saw that pleasure shouldn't require servants or wealth, that a good idea carefully executed could transform an entire industry. She filed her patent in her own name at a time when women rarely asserted such ownership, claiming credit for her contribution. History has been slow to remember her fully, but her invention spoke for itself. All of them, and thousands of others whose names we don't know, were solving the same problem from different angles. They were figuring out how to make ice cream survive in a world without refrigeration. In doing so, they created an infrastructure of knowledge, technique, and technology that outlasted its original purpose. The yakhchāls no longer store ice for summer use, but their engineering principles influenced modern passive cooling systems being explored as sustainable alternatives to air conditioning. The ice trade is long dead, but the global cold chain that replaced it, refrigerated ships, trucks, and warehouses moving temperature-sensitive goods around the world, grew from seeds Tudor and others planted. The hand-crank freezers gather dust in antique stores, but the understanding they embodied about agitation during freezing remains central to ice cream production. What survived wasn't the specific technologies but the knowledge embedded in them. Later generations could abandon the old methods precisely because those methods had succeeded well enough to support the development of better ones. You could only invent mechanical refrigeration after ice became abundant enough that people understood what reliable cold made possible. You could only design electric ice cream makers after hand-cranked versions had demonstrated the importance of continuous churning. Each innovation built on previous innovations in a chain stretching back thousands of years. The person operating an industrial ice cream factory today is the inheritor of all that accumulated wisdom. Even if they've never seen a yakhchāl or a hand-cranked freezer, they benefit from centuries of trial and error, of small discoveries and dramatic breakthroughs, of forgotten experiments and celebrated inventions. And the ice cream itself? It remains remarkably similar to what ancient Persians might have recognized. Yes, modern ice cream contains stabilizers and emulsifiers that didn't exist centuries ago. Yes, it's frozen more precisely, stored more reliably, distributed more widely. But the essential experience, cold cream, sweet flavor, smooth texture, the pleasant shock of cold on a warm day, this hasn't changed. There's something profound in that continuity. In a world of constant change and innovation, where technologies become obsolete within years, and entire industries rise and fall within decades, ice cream connects us to people who lived thousands of years ago. They wanted the same simple pleasure we want. They worked to create it with whatever resources and knowledge they possessed, and they succeeded well enough that their creation survived to reach us, transformed but recognizable. The story of how ice cream survived without refrigeration is ultimately a story about what survives. Not specific technologies which are always temporary, but the desires and creativity that drive their development. We still want what the Persians wanted, something cold and sweet and delightful. We still solve problems the way they did, through observation, experimentation, and the willingness to invest effort in pursuit of pleasure. On that warm evening, as ice cream is made and served and savoured around the world, all of this history is present even if unacknowledged. The child eating a cone doesn't think about yakhchāls or ice harvests or freezing point depression. They just taste something delicious, feel the cold sweetness, experience a moment of simple pleasure. But that pleasure carries within it the accumulated ingenuity of centuries. Every scoop is an inheritance, a gift passed down from people who cared enough about frozen desserts to build impossible structures, to ship ice across oceans, to invent better machines, to perfect techniques through patient practice. Ice cream survived without refrigeration because people wanted it to survive. They wanted it badly enough to solve every obstacle that stood in the way. And in solving those obstacles, they left behind more than just ice cream. They left behind a legacy of creativity, persistence, and the conviction that making life sweeter, sometimes literally, was worth whatever effort it required. That legacy lives on in every ice cream maker, every gelatier, every parent cranking an old-fashioned freezer while children watch eagerly. It lives in the knowledge that pleasure is worth pursuing, that obstacles are worth overcoming, that human creativity can make possible what seems impossible. The ice cream melts, as it always has, but the delight it provides, and the human ingenuity that makes it possible, endures.